Hi, everybody. Good morning to everybody on the West Coast. Good afternoon to everybody in the East Coast. Hi to everybody in the middle. Good evening to everybody in the UK and Europe. And I also believe there are a bunch of people in Australia. So those zooming in from Australia, good new morning to you. Thanks very much for joining. I'm really excited to be here today. Writing is definitely not something that comes naturally to me. In the book, I describe it a little bit like walking through thick mud in waders while wrestling an anaconda. It's not an easy job at all for me. However, I do recommend it because it's great to be here today with 70,000 words wrapped up, available on Amazon in an ebook and paperback. The audiobook will be out as well soon. So it's really, really good to be here. Most leaders don't really understand that developing a strong company culture is critically important. The problem is they don't actually know how to do it. And this is the reason I wrote this book, Own Your Culture. The aim is to provide a practical blueprint for CEOs and founders and leaders of companies to be able to build their own culture. And I'm really excited to have two of the world's sort of foremost experts on company culture and remote work join us today. David Cummings is the founder of Atlanta Ventures, and Darren Murph is the head of remote at Gitlab. We'll kick things off with David, and he's going to be interviewing me about the book. And after that, I'll interview Darren about Gitlab. Gitlab was recently voted the second most popular company to work for in the tech industry after SpaceX, which is a pretty impressive achievement if you consider that remote work wasn't really a thing for most people 8 or 9 months ago. I first met David a couple of years ago at the Sastra conference in San Jose. David's a successful entrepreneur and investor. He founded Pardot out of university, and he sold that to Salesforce for $100 million. He went on to found Atlanta Ventures, which is the fourth largest accelerator or tech hub in the US. And he's invested in some awesome companies like SalesLoft, Terminus, and Calendly, which is a great success so far. 200 people, and I think it's doing 60 million with very little funding. The highlight for me, however, of David's illustrious career, irrespective of what he might think, is the fact that he coined the phrase, culture is the one sustainable competitive advantage that an entrepreneur has control over. This is such a powerful way of encapsulating the impact and importance of company culture. So David, it's really great to have you with us today. Thanks very much for joining us.
Brett, thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here, and congrats on the launch of the new book. What a great milestone. Now, I know that you're a published author already. You graciously handed me a copy of your previous book when we were together in California a couple years ago, and I enjoyed diving into the culture decoded there. But wow, what a time it is to be talking about culture, right? It feels like the world has been turned upside down from the pandemic, forcing companies to do a lot of things that were unnatural to them previously. Right? Work from home, work from anywhere, contemplating becoming remote first, contemplating becoming fully remote. The number of culture-oriented questions that come out of that is just astounding. So I think the timing on your book has been incredible. You know, in the book, Own Your Culture, some of the things that I liked the most was just the number of amazing anecdotes from different high-growth companies. And so for me, I'm always interested in learning stories. I'm always interested in hearing what other entrepreneurs are doing. And so your book just does a phenomenal job of capturing so many of these awesome stories and anecdotes and lessons learned from other high growth companies.
Thank you.
So I wanted to kick it off and start the questions, if that works for you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. That's a lovely introduction. Thank you.
All right, so writing a book, you've done it before. This one is a bit longer, a bit more comprehensive. What was the hardest part about writing it?
So for me, the hardest part really is the writing. I think that's because my brain doesn't work the way a writer's brain should. Um, I, I metaphorically hit the wall sort of a number of times while writing this book, and at times I just couldn't see the words for the trees, because I first blogged about the stories, and then I tried to write the book. And I'm very lucky that I married well, and my wife Monica was there to, frankly, kick my ass into gear and get me writing, but also give me the perspective I needed to look at the book in the way it needed to be looked at. It did take me 3 years to write, and my writing is not actually the only reason it took me so long. The other challenges I faced was that I actually struggled to find companies and leaders I could interview. I would be referred to a company, great culture, you've got to go and speak to that CEO. And as soon as I started to ask the deeper level questions about culture, I realized that that company didn't really have a strong culture. It was just a lot of sort of hot air around the values and a little bit of work that the leadership team had done. And I actually had to speak to over 500 companies to get to interview 50 of them. And it's a sort of pretty shocking statistic if you think about it, that 9 out of 10 companies have not invested in developing their culture. When, as you said in your quote, it is the one sustainable competitive advantage that an entrepreneur has complete control over. And I just found this sort of fascinating, that there is such a lack of true knowledge about what company culture is. And that's really what drove me to write this book.
So why do you think that is, that so many leaders don't care about their culture or don't invest in it?
I think it's because they can take it for granted. This switch to remote work has really put the cat amongst the pigeons. I think leaders relied on their offices too much, unbeknownst to them. Things just kind of happened and it kind of worked. And they could get away with not investing it or not even understanding it because it didn't matter that much. People were in the same room or in the same rooms. They were interacting, communicating, and getting by. Not optimally, as if you look at how remote companies work, you can argue that they are optimally better. But people were getting by. And I just think it was one of those things that a leader could go and say, I've got other fires burning, let's leave that until later.
So they were just letting it go organically, sort of like you could throw a bunch of seeds in a garden and you might get some flowers or some plants, but it's not going to be well organized. It's not necessarily going to be as healthy as it could, but it happens. And sometimes it works and sometimes it doesn't. Talk to me a little bit about the book and why the focus on culture from your perspective is different from some of the other books out there. You know, culture is a hot topic right now, especially with the pandemic. What makes your book different?
So a lot of the culture books I've read, and I've read a hell of a lot, are more looking at businesses that have been around for a long time. So they've had 10, 15, 20 years to develop their culture. And now this thing that is presented to the world looks like a beautifully polished operating machine. And there are great books on Nordstrom, Southwest, Zappos, Netflix, and many others. But they are 20 years in. You can learn a lot from these books, and I did learn a lot from these books. But they're essentially not really applicable to startups and high growth company cultures, because those cultures are developing. Most of what you read in those books is strategy, and it's not about the tactics. And so this book really is focused on startup and high growth companies and the tactics they use daily to embed their culture, to strengthen their culture. Each chapter, as you mentioned, has real life examples of what leaders do to make sure that their culture is lived by themselves and their team. They have different examples from different companies on, different phases of developing the culture. And, from my perspective, this is the first book that I'm aware of that focuses on this area where you could actually take the initiatives, the tools and techniques and apply it to your company right now.
Very cool. In the book, you talk about mistakes that leaders make in defining their core values. Can you talk us through some of those?
Sure. Yeah. This is a little bugbear of mine. These two in particular. The first mistake that's made is the leadership team go and decide the values without including the rest of the organization. Mm-hmm. And if it doesn't matter if your business is 1,000, 200, I believe that you should always include the rest of the team as much as possible in this process, whether you're defining or refining your core values, because you then get engagement, you get ownership, you get commitment, and you also get culture representatives, you get culture evangelists from the people who are involved, who can speak to the rest of the team on their level, not leadership talking down. The second one, which is the big mistake that most companies make, is not defining the expected behaviors associated with the values. So values, unless they are clearly defined, are vague and open to interpretation, which makes them meaningless and mostly useless. Because human beings' natural inclination is to interpret things for their benefit, not for the company's benefit. And this is an area where
I've seen it many times walking into an office and they have the core values printed on the wall, at the receptionist's desk. And oftentimes it'll be the most vague, generic terms like integrity, right? So you walk into a business, what business is going to say, oh no, we don't have integrity? So I do feel like there's a number of values that are defined that are really just table stakes that shouldn't even be defined. It should be a higher level up, something that's more important from a values point of view. So I know exactly what you're talking about, and I've seen it many times. In the book, you talk about different CEO archetypes. Can you give us an example of one of them, or maybe your favorite one or most common?
So I can give you an example of one of the leaders I interviewed in the book, a guy named Bernard Niesner, who's the CEO of Busu. And it's a great example because in the book, he talks about his learning, and essentially he transitioned from what I call the tick box CEO archetype to the culture aware CEO archetype. And basically this came about because in the early days, Bernard did what most CEOs do, and he literally ticked the box by creating a set of values with his team, put the posters up on the walls, got the mouse mats, and did a big launch, and then got back to doing what they were doing, and everything went back to normal and nothing else changed. And where Bernard realized the issue is his company went through a very, very difficult period. And as soon as things got difficult, people started leaving the organization. And he realized that actually the people who he'd hired were not really bought into his vision and didn't fit with the values of his company. And that made him really, after he'd got through the difficult period, he then rethought through his values and then designed a way to recruit against them and made sure that the people he hired from them on were a good fit with the values. And it's a great example of somebody going from the tick box CEO to a culture aware CEO. That often doesn't happen to CEOs. They tick the box and then they don't realize that they're not gifted with the pain that Bernard experienced, and they don't realize that that's a problem until it's too late.
I experienced a similar scenario firsthand. 13 years ago, I walked into my company and I had meetings scheduled on my calendar with my team, and I wasn't looking forward to those meetings because of certain people. And so I personally went through a journey to peel back the layers. Why wasn't I wanting to work with some of my teammates? And of course, I arrived at culture, and I arrived at the fact that we didn't have aligned values. And so that was really the thing that spurred my devotion to understanding culture, nurturing it, and trying to do the best that I can. Last week in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article where they interviewed CEOs about work from home, work from anywhere, the pandemic, how all those pieces have been affecting the culture and work life at their businesses. And one of the people that they interviewed in that Wall Street article last week was Reed Hastings, the founder and CEO of Netflix. And in the article, they said, "Oh, when do you think employees are going to come back to the office?" And he said, 6 months after a COVID vaccine. And then they said, "Well, what else do you think will be different?" And he said, "Well, I want everybody to be in the office. Maybe we'll do Fridays work from home." And so he was very adamant about bringing everybody back together. But he also acknowledged that it could be 12, 18 months before that can even happen. You know, talking about Netflix makes me think of their famous culture deck that they published a number of years ago. And I know you've read it and I know you've studied it. What else should companies do to communicate their culture beyond a culture deck?
So I think this is such an important piece of businesses moving forward, is actually being able to communicate their culture beyond the culture deck. So there's one of your investments, actually, a company called Sales Loft. I had the pleasure of interviewing about 8, 9, 10 months ago now. And they do an incredible job of communicating their culture on their website. And what I like about it is not just a sort of a half-hearted attempt with, somewhere on the careers page. You can actually see the way the company's weaved the culture into the way they talk about recruitment, the way they talk about how important the customers are. It's not just a sales pitch to the customer. And I really like the way they've done that. I think, you need to think about all social media. You need to think about what, for example, Gitlab do. They have an open, document that they share with everybody that explains how the business works and how their culture works. This is something that we have to do now because we relied on osmosis for people to understand how the culture works. We relied on, when people walked into our office for a meeting, they would get a sense of the culture and think, okay, I kind of like this space, or I don't like this space. And now that's not going to happen. It won't happen for a while. So companies are going to have to get better at documenting their culture and getting their culture out into the world.
So it reminds me of another culture story related to that, of communicating it. And I believe it was Zappos, I'm not positive, but they had a culture book. And in the book, they captured a number of the inside jokes in the business. They captured a number of reasons why the company does things the way they do that were sort of idiosyncratic. And I remember thinking that was such a great idea, because you say you're a new employee, you show up at the office or you show up on remote, and there is jargon, there is terminology, there are inside jokes that people at the company already have. And so the faster you can give a big bear hug to that new employee or that new team member and make them feel a part of the tribe, the better everything is going to be. And so I remember reading about that many years ago and thinking, what is such a great idea.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
Now, the next question is a tougher one, right? Culture to a lot of people sounds fuzzy. It sounds like kumbaya. It sounds like, singing from the same hymn book, things like that. But there's plenty of entrepreneurs and CEOs out there that are very metrics oriented. They want to know, what's the return on investment for investing in culture? How would you define an ROI, and how do you think about it?
So there are a number of tools that are available now that can give you an idea of part of your culture. So there are employee engagement tools that companies are using a lot now to get a sense of where do we rank in comparison to everybody else. Give us a number, and in comparison to our cohort of companies. And so more companies are getting this right more and more. But actually, there's no real firm solution to this yet. And actually, part of my mission in life is to actually change this, to turn culture into recognize it as a critical business function and turn it into something that you can manage and measure. It makes me think of Rick Perot, who's the CEO of Unbounce, the Canadian landing page and marketing platform. When he and I were chatting, he was explaining to me how valuable the values were, and one of their values is being transparent. And to demonstrate transparency in action, what Unbounce do is they actually they give each new joiner access to all of their data, and then do a presentation on all of their financial data. They share the financial data on a monthly basis with the company. And I'm not sure if he's still doing this now, but when I spoke to him, he was actually writing a blog post where they would actually put down everything, then all of their numbers, the works for everybody to see. And he didn't, I can understand him doing it internally, but he didn't have to do it externally. And I asked him why, and he said, Brett, it works. We don't have to do it, but we've had situations where candidates have chosen us in a hugely competitive market over other companies because we live the transparency value. And he'd done the numbers, and 12 months before I spoke to him, they'd grown by 100 people during that time. They'd opened their third international office. They had experienced less than 1% turnover. And 99% of new hires had been made without a recruiter. And he calculated that the ROI to the company was probably in the region of around $1.5 million that year.
Wow. I can totally appreciate that in terms of reducing turnover, reducing the need for external recruiters. And then of course, there's the productivity side, which is somewhat harder to measure, but I've seen it firsthand so many times to know that it's real. Now with Unbounce, you mentioned a little bit about training new hires and having, the great game of business where you make all the financials deeply available and explain what they mean. What are some other best practices or things that you recommend when it comes to onboarding new hires to getting them acclimated into a culture?
So this is something that companies with the pandemic are going to have to really work hard on and rejig. But essentially what most companies are trying to do is get their people as productive as possible. And I think that's actually the wrong thing to be doing. I think the first thing you need to do is you need to create an environment where that person can be themselves and feel psychologically safe to be themselves. You need to create an environment where they can hit the ground running and not find it too hard to demonstrate their skills quickly. They need to be able to understand what the culture is, both the obvious culture, but also the underlying currents of the culture. And they need to be in a situation where they can learn as quickly as possible. So I look at onboarding in two ways. You've got the cultural experiential side and you've got the functional side. And so working out what you can communicate about your culture and how you do that, whether that's through a buddy, whether it's through your documentation, but looking at the culture and saying, how do we get this information across to them? And getting the relationships built so that the trust can be done, trust can be increased is so critical. And then on the functional side, get the usual things, get the meeting set up, get their equipment set up, get their the learning and development set up. Because if you look at culture, it's essentially onboarding is the first time they experience your company culture for real. Like this is, all of this could have been hot air and up until this very moment where we now see the rubber hits the road. So there's definitely it requires a strong process and most people don't start the communication with the successful candidate early enough. The best cadence I've seen is minus 30 days, minus 15, minus 10, minus 5, minus 3, 2, 1, 0, 1, 2, 3 days, so that different people who were part of the interview process are interviewing or interacting with the new joiner even before they've joined. They're getting documentation, they're meeting their buddy, they're meeting their manager, etc., etc. So I think this is something that it's one of the pieces of the puzzle that I talk about in the book, and I think it's something that companies need to really be a little bit more disciplined about.
I love that term, the psychological safety, because we see it too often. It's like, oh, it's a new hire, let's just start seeing them do work. And if you don't have that underlying foundation, then you're just not setting them up for success.
Yeah.
All right, so now my hottest topic, the area that I'm very interested in, very curious about, is, of course, what does the future of work look like? Is it hybrid? Is it remote first? Is it fully remote? Is it back to normal as quick as possible? And so it's an area that I've been paying a lot of attention to lately, talking to a number of entrepreneurs about, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on this. Where's the world headed? What do you think is going to happen?
Wow, if I knew that. Well, I can look into my glass, my glass sphere and imagine. But I think actually that leaders are hoping that it's all of these things. Some leaders are hoping that we go back to normal, and some leaders are going, okay, great. I realize we can work remote. Now we're going to go fully remote. And then some leaders are, and I think this is the majority, are going to try and do this hybrid model where they'll have some people working from home and some people working from the office, and an interaction between the two. I think that hybrid is where most companies are going to try and go, and it's a dangerous place to go because it's harder to lead a hybrid environment. It's harder to manage a hybrid environment because it's easy to get an us and a them situation, us in the office, them as remote. The people in the office are not included in discussions, in decision-making. They don't feel they're part of the culture. They don't experience work in the same way. And that banter, the informal communication just happens in the office. So I think that if companies are going to go hybrid, they have to treat their business like a remote business, which, as we were discussing earlier, this remote first approach. And I just think that if companies don't, the people working remote are going to end up feeling like second-class citizens. And if you feel like a second-class citizen with thousands more remote companies that would be happily take you in as a first-class citizen, you're going to get a lot of people leaving because they want to work remote. That's just, they realize that spending 2 hours in a car or on a train is not worth it. Life's not, that's not worth it. So it's still got to pan out, but I think hybrid is probably where it's going to end up for a lot of companies, and I'm very concerned about them not doing it right.
Well, good. I really appreciate your time and diving into these questions. This has been excellent. And so now it's time to turn it over for the second half of the webinar.
David, thanks very much. It was good to catch up and chat it again. Next, I'd like to introduce Darren Murph. Darren leads the remote charge for Gitlab, where he is the head of remote. He's one of the leading spokespeople for how remote should be done right. He wrote the Gitlab remote playbook, which I recommend. And more recently, he led the creation of Gitlab's remote management course on Coursera, which is free. And I also highly recommend. That being said, I've only done week 1, but it's brilliant. Great content. It's free. Do it. Apart from all of these great things, spreading the gospel of remote, Darren is also an author. While living the remote dream, also the title of his book, he's traveled to over 50 countries, visited 50 US states. He's flown more than 1 million miles on Delta alone. I can't remember if I don't know if that's last year.
No, that took 10 years, but it did. Yeah, it did happen.
He also holds the Guinness world record as the planet's most prolific professional blogger. Darren, it's great to have you here.
Thanks for having me. Really enjoyed the conversation with David as well, and looking forward to our time here.
Really cool, thanks. So prior to Gitlab, you were a wandering soul, as it were. You're just doing amazing stuff and writing, just writing a lot. But how did you get hired into Gitlab, and how does the Gitlab recruitment process differ from other companies that you've experienced?
Yeah, so I've worked across the spectrum of remote my entire career. I have spent time in co-located spaces. I've spent most of my career in various forms of hybrid remote engagements, and now at Gitlab, an all remote environment. So I have been fortunate to see the evolution of remote. I started working remotely about 15 years ago, well before the advent of 3G. The average laptop would last about 37 minutes. So trust me when I say tools and technology have come a long way. What we have to figure out is the mindset and culture around enabling people to do their best work no matter where they are. So Gitlab recruited me in to lead the charge on remote. Gitlab has been all remote since the beginning, but as the company scaled, they wanted to make sure there was a leader in place to scale the information and the knowledge that was documented on how we did everything from meetings to asynchronous workflows. And they wanted someone there to essentially be an internal strategy consultant for new people joining the company, to help people onboard more appropriately, to acclimate well to working remotely. And as the company scaled, we had to put a lot of intentionality and focus on ensuring that people had an inclusive atmosphere to work well remotely. Fast forward till now, and it turns out a lot of the information that we have open sourced along the way is now becoming the blueprint for how other companies are making their own remote transition coming out of COVID.
And so do you think it's right that other companies use GitLab's way to the extent that they do? Because, cultures are unique, and, I'm not sure, how does the GitLab way and a company culture intermingle?
Yeah, this is a great question. In fact, one of our sub-values, so if you Google GitLab values, you will find our values page. I think it's the most comprehensive values page of any company that I've ever seen. We have 6 core values, but what you should pay attention to are the sub-values, the substantiators underneath of them. That part is continually evolving and being added to, and simply this is how we exemplify, how we live out our values. And one of those is culture fit is a bad excuse. And we are very explicit about hiring for values fit. We want to make sure that people align with our values, that we are behaviorally aligned. And what this does is it ensures that people have a firm foundation on what the company is about. And if they're aligned with it, we don't hide our strategy. We give it out in advance so people can opt into this way of working. But also what this allows is for people to bring all of their culture to the company and create a higher bar for culture. If you hire for culture fit, you might meet the status quo, but the bar will always stay the same. It will simply fit. If you hire for values fit and you allow people to bring what makes them authentically them to the company, your your culture becomes even richer and more diverse. And crucially, we allow people to stay where they are. We hire people where they are based. We allow them to stay there. That makes our product more inclusive. We have more eyes and ears around the world that are taking a look at local perspectives and local markets. And of course, all of that gets fed back into the product, but it also gets fed back into the way we treat each other and the shared understanding we have. It's really amazing to have people in over 67 countries and see the way that we live and we work and the holidays that we celebrate. It all kind of gets woven back into the tapestry of what makes us GitLab. Now, open sourcing all of that is core to who we are. Our mantra is everyone can contribute, and we want people that have figured remote things out to actually contribute back to our handbook and help us make it better. We believe that by sharing this information, the rising tide will lift all boats. We want to contribute to making remote first and all remote something that is more the norm and less the exception. A shared understanding of how people can work this way will be better for society as a whole.
Yeah, I'd agree. I'd agree with that. I think I recommend, if you haven't looked at the GitLab document, please do. It's a mammoth piece of work. But what I like about it is you can actually see that most documents and most documentation go into a folder to die, never to be seen again. And there's no folder; it's there and it's open, and you can flow through it. You mentioned onboarding, and David was talking about onboarding earlier. Can you give us what tips do you have around onboarding people now that most companies did it in an office-based fashion previously?
Yeah, so quick aside here, GitLab tries to answer everything with a link. And so in this case, you can Google GitLab onboarding and you'll find all of our documentation on that. It does a much better job of explaining that I can in the next 60 seconds. But I will say you have to be very prescriptive about remote onboarding. You have to write down what onboarding looks like. You have to point people to the right places so that to the best they can, they're able to self-serve and find all of the information they need. So instead of being alone and isolated and not knowing what virtual shoulder to tap to figure out who knows what, you write all of that down in advance and you listen to feedback as people onboard. And if there were any gaps, you write that down. And that's how you incrementally, iteratively make your onboarding process more inclusive. One thing that I'll say for companies that are writing all of that down right now, one thing you can do in the interim is pair every new hire with an onboarding buddy. Again, if you Google GitLab onboarding buddy, you'll find all of the duties for our buddies. Essentially, this is a company veteran that's been around. They know people, they know where to look, and new hires can ping this person with any questions that they have. And this person is responsible for making sure they set up the right onboarding meetings so this person can acclimate as quickly as possible. In a typical onboarding setting, essentially you tell the new hire to just wander around the office and hopefully by osmosis, you'll run into the right people to start to build your network. But when you think about it, that's very inefficient. So at GitLab, we try to be a lot more prescriptive about that. And it's the onboarding buddy's duty to consider what the new hire's role is and who the right people are in the organization to start building those networks.
And that leads me on to a specific area of onboarding and recruitment generally that I'm interested in understanding a little bit more about. How do you take really young and inexperienced individuals and get them up to speed? Because that's where osmosis was valuable, because they could listen in, they could lean across and ask a question. They didn't have to look at a calendar, set up a Zoom meeting and ask Jackie about that thing that she was saying earlier today in 2 weeks' time. So, what is GitLab doing around the really young or really inexperienced individuals?
This may sound paradoxical, but the more you write down, you enable people to have to rely on humans a lot less for that osmosis. So you can shift the burden from humans to documentation. When I joined GitLab, I actually felt like I'd been working at the company for 6 months before my first day, because so much of it is already written down. You can read the values, you can read an FAQ on what it's like to work here. You can actually go into our GitLab issues and epics and see publicly what various teams are working on, what their objectives and key results are, what the KPIs and metrics are. All of that is written down. So we specifically hire people. We look for a subset of values called manager of one. And again, if you Google that, you'll find exactly what we mean by that. But generally, these are self-motivated, self-aware people that want to dig in, they want to read, they want to learn. And so if that information is available, we try to hire people that are self-motivated to dig into that. So we offload as much as we can into the documentation, and then we want our new hires to feedback on what's missing so that we can document and continue to fill those gaps. Currently, our handbook is over 7,000 or 8,000 pages if you printed it out, but it didn't start that way and it continues to grow. And the reason it grows is it's a living, breathing document. We say that we work handbook first. We're careful not to use the word documentation, but instead handbook first, so that it reinforces that this really is a living, breathing document. Even our values page gets continually updated.
Cool, thanks. How do you know when a new team member isn't working out? What are you looking for? What's the process?
Yep. So we have an entire page dedicated to underperformance, but generally we are very open and transparent about asking questions. So it's not a surprise. There's a very high burden on managers at GitLab to be articulate on what success looks like. So for a lot of leaders that have been transitioned to remote, one of the things they struggle with is, how do we know if our people are performing? How do we know if they're doing their job? Which links to a deeper, more systemic issue, which is, how did they not know what success looked like in the office? So this isn't a remote versus co-located thing. This is simply a business discipline thing that in a remote setting, it forces you to be more articulate about it. So when a manager clearly lays out what success looks like over the next quarter, it's in that moment that the direct report can come back and say, all right, I understand this, but I need this unblocked, or I need access to this tool, whatever it may be. Managers at GitLab are less directors and more unblockers, where direct reports are giving a high degree of autonomy to show up with feedback and with issues, and then it's on the manager to unblock them and let them run as fast as they can. And in one-on-ones, it's usually very obvious whether or not they're on track to meet the goals. And conversely, for managers, it's very obvious whether or not they are clearly defining what success looks like.
And do you, in terms of mentioning 101s, do you have different types of 101s? In other words, split up, you've got personal 101s versus business 101s, KPIs, et cetera. How does GitLab run those?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have work one-on-ones, which are fairly typical, and we try to do those uniformly across the company. And then one-on-ones, which are informal, are called coffee chats. And these are very, very important. We have over 15 different ways that we engage in informal communication to build culture, to build relationships. Coffee chats are one of those. We try to do a lot of work asynchronously, so we aren't spending all day on Zoom calls. That way we can allocate some of our mental energy to Zoom calls that are informal, just get to know you types of meetings, just to catch up on life. It doesn't have to be about work. Those are really important. For folks that are experiencing Zoom fatigue, you have to realize that if you spend 7 hours a day in Zooms for work, it's unlikely you're going to spend the last hour of your day in coffee chats getting to know people. So that behooves you to move more of your work asynchronously to open up more mental space for synchronous touch points that are steeped in relationship building and culture building.
And how often is there, for example, how big is your team?
So there's over 1,300 people at GitLab, and in our core marketing team, over 100 or so. So I guess it depends on perspective. It's not tiny, but it's also not huge. Depends on where you're coming from. I do want to say one thing on coffee chats. Every new hire is asked to complete 10 of those. So you start breaking the ice very early on, and onboarding buddies can help you set some of those up so it feels a bit less awkward just scanning the org chart, finding someone with an interesting name or title, or maybe an interesting location, since we're all on a team map, and then having a conversation.
And is there for example, the team that you manage, do you have, every Friday, this is when we do our coffee chats, once a month is when we do our, our business chats? How does that sort of a routine work?
Coffee chats are generally left up to the person on how often they want to do those. I have some one-on-ones that are bi-weekly. I have some that are weekly. For our core team, we tend to do stand-ups asynchronously. We use a tool called Geekbot. And so at the start of every Monday, it will ask 5 questions. Are you red, yellow, green? What did you do this weekend? What are your top 3 priorities for the week? Do you need anything unblocked? And finally, do you have any upcoming PTO coming up? And if not, why? Please get some on the schedule. A rest ethic is very important, equally important to a work ethic. And we do that to be inclusive of time zones so that people don't have to start their week right away with a synchronous call. Mondays are always crazy. And so this allows us to think, to process, to write it down, and then people can contribute to that and read that throughout the week.
And if the company is, you've got, let's say there's a 30-person startup, and they've been using Google Docs. How would you advise them to start building a documentation capability in the organization?
Yeah, you can use Google Docs in a lot of ways that you probably aren't. I'll give you one example. At GitLab, all work meetings have a Google Doc agenda attached to the invite. So if someone were to send me a work invite and there's not an agenda attached to it, you simply decline it. And that's written down in the handbook. So if a new hire gets a bunch of declines, inevitably they'll search the handbook for, why is this happening to me? And then you realize that this is a core part of making a work meeting work. So we make sure that temporal documentation happens in the meeting, and then any key takeaways are added to the relevant parts of the handbook. I would say to get started, Google Docs could work, but wikis generally don't scale. We have a handbook page on that as well. We use a static site. There are some other tools like Almanac that are knowledge hubs that you can build upon. You have to make it a core part of what you do. It can't be optional. We say if it's not in the handbook, it doesn't exist. And so if you make it core to getting work done, that will serve as a forcing function that documentation actually matters. And look, for companies that are transitioning, you should expect some friction in this. People that love verbalizing may not love documenting. It is a very specific way of working, and not everyone may be on board with it right away. So I would approach it iteratively. We believe in iteration at GitLab, and I would say this is true as well. You can't expect to have a full company handbook in a week, but maybe over the course of a year, you could say, all right, let's document 50% of our processes over the next year, and then we'll set quarterly milestones to make it a bit more digestible and understandable. And more importantly, empowering everyone to contribute to this is vital. If you just have your executive team manning the handbook, most people will eventually stop reading it, and it won't be a living, breathing organism. It has to be a key part of how your organization works. I'll drop one more term on you: single source of truth. Your company needs a single source of truth for workflows, for processes, for policies. If they are fragmented across email and Notion docs and Google Docs and Coda docs, and the engineering team has one source of truth and the legal team has another source of truth, you will continue to struggle and communication silos will happen. Again, this isn't exclusive to remote. This would be a problem that needs fixed in a hybrid environment or a co-located environment. But in an all remote environment, we have no choice but to address that head on.
And in terms of, if you think about what a company's got to start doing to do either fully remote or remote first properly, whether it's giving structure to your organization, both individual and team, whether it's communication, documentation, whether it's social connection, the async versus sync. Where do you start? And I've spoken to a bunch of chief people officers who are literally going, dear Lord, where on earth do I start with this? This is like everything's up in the air. I've got to start again.
Yes. So the first thing you should do is hire a head of remote. I'm going to plug my title a little bit, but in all seriousness, you're talking with chief people officers that are realizing remote cannot simply be a line item on their job description. There are so many things that have to be re-architected and rethought about. There's so much nuance to it, and everything will have a cascading effect on anything else. If you change up your compensation philosophy, that's going to impact team morale. That's going to impact talent branding. That's going to impact internal and external marketing. And eventually it will impact your Glassdoor ratings. You have to have someone in a position to think through all of the cascading series of events, to rally people and get people on board, and to set up a proper remote transition plan. Again, this is an iterative journey. So starting with a person or a remote leadership council, someone that this is their full-time job. This cannot be a part-time initiative. The second thing is documentation. You have to start creating a single source of truth and moving as much information to that as soon as possible. And the third thing is convert every workflow into remote first. You have to make sure that if you keep an office or multiple offices, they are not epicenters of decision-making, of praise, of promotion. An office is simply another place to go work remotely. It cannot be on a higher pedestal than an airplane seat or a hotel conference room or a spare bedroom or a WeWork or a Coty or any other physical location. And the only way that's going to be true is if you implement remote first practices. You want to make sure if someone crosses paths in a physical hallway, instead of blurting out 2 sentences and incubating an idea, They simply grab that person, go back to their desk, open up Slack, and then type out that 2-sentence thought that they had and let that innovative idea incubate across the entire company instead of just 2 people in a hallway. This isn't rocket science, but it's rewiring and re-architecting how you think to make sure you're inclusive of everyone when you can't assume that any given person will be in any physical location on a given day.
And just to give people an idea, people who are used to synchronous communication, how do you get asynchronous communication right where you think or you need something right now? What's the GitLab? I'm sure there's do a search for GitLab asynchronous communication. This is how you do it. But just give us an idea of that, and maybe also transitioning to more asynchronous.
Yes, you're correct in that the guide does exist, but I will say this is tough. Asynchronous and intentionality are in the final phases of remote adaptation, and it takes a long time to get there. Phase 1 of remote adaptation is skeuomorphism. You simply press copy on the office environment and try to paste it into a virtual environment. That's probably where most people are right now, and it's getting a bit uncomfortable because you really aren't taking advantage of the virtual landscape. Asynchronous takes a while to get to. It takes 2 things from the outset. One is a tool. At GitLab, we use GitLab. It is built for asynchronous project management and collaboration. If you don't use GitLab, you need some sort of tool where all work can be funneled to. If you try to make a mix of carrier pigeon and email and Zoom, you'll never really be able to operate well asynchronously. You have to have a tool that's designed for it. And the second thing is you have to implement forcing functions to get people to do it. It is not the path of least resistance. For example, at GitLab, we expire all of our Slack messages after 90 days. Why do we do this? So people won't put 8-paragraph missives in Slack. They'll put them in a GitLab issue where it will have a much longer life. It's much more transparent. People can collaborate there. You're not going to work in Slack if you know it's going to vanish in 3 months. No one wants their best thoughts to vanish in 3 months. It also has a secondary function of making it great for informal communication. If we can't talk about work, we have to talk about things like parenting. And believe me, our parenting channel is flourishing right now with parents all over the world commiserating and collaborating on remote learning and being a teacher's aide. You have to implement these forcing functions. They may feel a bit awkward at first, but what you'll find if you commit to them is that they improve discipline and cohesion. If you funnel work into one place and you funnel informal communication into another, you can breathe a little bit easier knowing that no matter where someone is in the world, this is where work happens. This is where culture happens. It's a much more liberating experience than having to continually wonder if you're missing out on something.
And in terms of my thinking around hybrid work is that a lot of companies are going to think that they can run the business the way they are or the way they were, and I see a lot of pain coming down the road for companies like that. That being said, going to remote first does seem like a real massive uphill battle challenge, and the companies I work with, which are typically high growth startups, they are under-resourced and struggling anyway to just get the day job done. So it seems like we're in this tricky situation where there's no magic bullet at all, but also there isn't enough knowledge out there or a path out there for most of these companies to take. Obviously, you guys are doing such a great job of leading this. And I think the course that you created is brilliant from week 1 anyway. I'll come back to you on the other weeks when I use them, but really is very good. Have you got any other thoughts on hybrid and the dangers and issues around hybrid work?
Yes. So for starters, if you can't find a head of remote, start by hiring a lead documentarian, someone that can just get into your most key meetings and start writing down. A former journalist is a great archetype for this. They think about things in terms of codification and taxonomy, and they can just be there to write things down, and then you can scale it from there. The other point of advice I would give you, if you're struggling in making just this transition, Start by implementing the changes that would help you in a co-located office setting anyway. What I mean by that is if you don't currently document your meetings, start. Add a Google Doc agenda to every meeting, make it a forcing function, because even if you put your workplace fully back in the office, this will still make your meetings better. This will make them more conclusive. This will make them more inclusive. You'll have less knowledge leaks. So even if you aren't quite sure how remote is going to work out for you, start with things that will make your team more disciplined, even in a co-located setting. That way you know that you aren't quote unquote wasting time. The key thing to remember in a hybrid environment is that there will be a two-tier system. People that are on-site by default will have one experience, and people who are off-site by default will have another experience. You need a leader in charge of looking at those all the time and trying to make them as balanced and as equal as possible to make sure that information flows are happening, that cultural flows are happening. And one other point that I will say, for companies that think there's no way I could unwind all of our leases, we have to maintain some real estate. Use that to whatever advantage you can. Strategically deploy travel to make sure that in-person engagements happen in a way that will build culture, that will accelerate strategy. When I talk about synchronous and asynchronous, they aren't one versus the other. Strategically use synchronous touch points and in-person engagements to catalyze weeks or months or years of great asynchronous work. So it's not like they're combative. They work together. You just have to be strategic about it. And look, I'm a million miler on Delta. There's a jet behind me. I love travel. Even if you're going all remote, in-person engagement really matters. At Gitlab, we get the entire company together every 9 to 12 months for a summit called Gitlab Contribute. We try to bring people together for sales events and conferences as much as we can, forecasting to post-COVID where travel restrictions are lifted, of course. But when you can do that, do that. I've had some leaders ask me, how do you onboard completely remotely? And I ask, wait, as if they're never going to see anyone? And they say, yeah, like that isn't the right solve. Solve for what is coming next. What we're in right now is, I know it feels like a lot, but it's a grain of sand in the grand arc of time. People need to see each other. Be strategic about it. Even an all remote company with no offices, we're very intentional about in-person.
Well, I really appreciate the time, Darren. It's we've got some very nice comments from people saying thanks very much to Darren and David. It's been great. One of the companies that I have had the pleasure of interviewing is called Hotjar, and I'm sure you know those guys really well. There's an interesting one comment I wanted to make is it seems like a lot of these companies are thinking that they can save a lot of money. This may be $10,000 or $14,000 per person from their office and put that in the bank. And actually, if you look at it, that's completely the wrong way to do it. I mean, Hotjar, they invest 10,000 euros a year in the perks that they give to their employees. And literally, when I spoke to David, he said, I'm investing the money I could be saving into my culture, into my people, into my team. And if you run through it, I think it's a 2,000 euros a year holiday budget, 4,000 euros to set up their offices, 2,400 for working space allowance, 1,000 for personal development, and on and on and on. I recommend people go and have a look at the Hotjar manual as well. Thanks very much for everybody's time. I hope you've enjoyed it. And Darren and David, I'd love to do this again sometime soon. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks for the collaboration and great questions. Be well all.
Bye-bye.